What's going on? This is Zane Simon. I am here for a special edition of the UFC Cutting Room Floor, a show that I thought I had more or less been forced to retire after. I, and I'm screwing things up already by leaving my YouTube stream open while I film this. So, for those who got a momentary feedback there, my apologies. Anyway, I thought I was done with this show. The UFC recently had stopped cutting people. Frankly, that's mostly they haven't released anyone for months and months now. They didn't do it on a regular schedule, and when they're not releasing people on a regular schedule, I can't really do a regular show about it. But they have now just initiated what is pretty much the largest UFC roster purge in my memory. And I've been following their roster for years and years and years now. And I can't ever remember them going through it like this. They have so far today cut 35 fighters. I would not be surprised. It appears they've cut 35 fighters. I say this, they have been cleaning out their digital fighter, their active roster on UFC.com. And most of these cuts make sense. Most of the cuts they've announced in general, the removal of 102 fighters, 70 or so of those are fighters that have already officially announced their retirement or been announced as released in the past. So it's not exactly news going on there. And so this isn't, this is otherwise, they've got 35 fighters on top of that appear to be gone. And like I say, when you've got 75 that are gone already, another 35 on top of that, it's hard to think that those fighters are anything other than gone. And classically, having followed this for years and years and years, when the UFC deletes a fighter from their online active roster, it's like a 99% certainty that fighter is no longer with the promotion. So up to now, I can give you a quick rundown of the fighters that are newly released. Most surprising names on there. Well, the biggest names are Brock Lesnar, Lorenz Larkin, and Rick Story. Larkin and Story, both free agents. Lesnar obviously suspended for a long time right now after the UFC 200 doping scandal and his failed drug tests. But it's a little surprising to see the UFC actually actively cut ties with Lesnar after that. I was pretty sure that they were just going to hold on to him, and if he wanted to fight again, he'd be fighting again in the UFC. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'll give you a quick rundown of all the names here so far. Like I said, this is still going. I don't know if they're going to release more fighters today. I'm just figured I'd do this at this point because it's already big enough to be really unusual. So far, Anthony Burchak, Clay Collard, Maximo Blanco, John Herrera, Brock Lesnar, Taylor Lapilus, Sohee Ham, Takeya Mizugaki, Brendan O'Reilly, Eric Perez, Lorenz Larkin, Rick Story, Jessamine Duke, Cole Miller, Elvis Matopchich, Joe Gelati, Freddie Serrano, Fernando Bruno, Yaoji Kui, Adam Hunter, Joey Gomez, Bartosz Fabinski, Augusto Montano, Yautzin Meza, Yves Jabouin, Milana Dudieva, Anton Zafir, Tony Sims, Lucas Sayevsky, Tiago Trator, Kenny Robertson, Francisco Rivera, Roldan Sangchaan, Hassan Umalatov, and John De Los Reyes. So there's some surprises in there. A few fighters who are off of wins or even multiple wins, fighters like Taylor Lapilus and Bartosz Fabinski, who have generally done really well in the UFC while they've been there. Now, there's word that Lapilus is at the end of his deal, and several other fighters on the list may have fought out their contracts with the UFC and been trying to renegotiate. So it could be that this is just a new era in UFC negotiation and roster management. And if you fight out your deal, they're going to remove you from the roster until you renegotiate. But classically, like, for years and years and years now, the case has always been if they remove you, it's done under the basic assumption that you are just gone. There have been exceptions to that, notably Sam Cecilia and Jake Ellenberger, I believe, both got removed from the roster only to work out something immediately afterward with Joe Silva or Sean Shelby to come back and have another fight and to get a new contract. But those are extremely rare exceptions. So, I'm going to be following along to see what happens to Eric Perez and Rick Story and Lorenz Larkin and Taylor Lapalus and Bartosz Fabinski and fighters like that in the near future. But the history has always been you get clipped off the website and you're gone. So I'm not holding my breath to see these fighters fighting in the UFC again anytime soon. It also looks like, they're fighters who are getting suspended for drug test failures for long periods of time that the UFC is otherwise not invested in, maybe going. Adam Hunter never fought for the UFC before failing a drug test and getting on sideline for 2 years. He's gone now. And I'm not surprised to see some moves in that direction. And if that continues, like, Brock Lesnar being in the same boat, more or less there. I don't know. This is kind of remarkable. Obviously, part of this too is just data cleanup. As somebody who's been following the UFC roster as long as I have, the UFC's had about 100 names, 120 fighters worth of bloat on their roster for years. Fighters that they cut a long time ago, that retired a long time ago, that have been injured and basically stopped their career for years. You have, I think, Royce Gracie just got removed from the UFC roster officially a couple of weeks ago, and Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz and fighters like that Chael Sonnen just got removed. Fighters have been hanging around this for a long, long time. So a lot of the 100+ names that have been removed today are just data cleanup, which is also in itself kind of shocking to see the UFC doing that kind of data cleanup, getting rid of somebody like Miesha Tate and Tim Kennedy and Sean O'Connell and all these other fighters who have just retired. That's kind of surprising to see. But it also looks like they're just doing a lot of house cleaning. A lot of fighters who've lost a couple fights. Guys like Joe Gelati and Elvis Mutapcic, who underperformed on their initial contracts, Clay Collard. Those are all kind of classic cuts, a lot of those. But mixed in are some other, like I say, other surprising names, people you don't expect to see in there. And it may usher in a new era for the UFC's negotiation. We may see these fighters back in the promotion right away. They're just in the middle of a drawn out negotiation period. But I don't know. I'm not all that high on it, and it's surprising to me to see it. Lorenz Larkin especially, I believe there's talk that he wasn't going to get a Bellator deal, that either fell through or they didn't make him an offer. So him suddenly not being on the UFC roster either at this point really, makes me wonder, is he headed to Ryzen? Is he going to be fighting in, he's a big name. If he's not going to Bellator and if he's not going to the UFC, and Ryzen would be about the only other promotion that it would make any sense for him to be fighting with. Otherwise, I can't imagine he's going to be getting any kind of deal from Legacy or the new the new Resurrection Fighting Alliance Legacy Fighting mashup out there, or M1 Global going over to Europe. That doesn't really seem all that likely. KSW, these promotions, there are promotions out there that might pay him for a fight or two, but it's hard to see Larkin getting anything like the contract he would have had in the UFC if it's not coming from Bellator. So I'm really wondering about that. There are a few fighters too in there, like Eric Perez, where it's kind of makes me wonder, have these fighters has Eric Perez retired, has Bartosz Fabinski retired, fighters who've had injuries that have stalled their career. Does that mean that they're not going to, they're not coming back anytime soon? And so the UFC is just parting ways with them. I don't know. It's kind of a shock. So I thought I'd put together a brief show to look at it and announce it and give information to all the people who only see things and listen to things and don't ever really feel like reading anything, because this is pretty big news to me, and it shows a real dedication from the UFC to get their roster to look something like what who's actually on it, which it hasn't looked anything like that for about the past half decade. And that that's a welcome thing to someone like me who's been tracking this thing forever and who had to start. When I started the Wikipedia UFC roster page about 7 years ago now, I started it entirely because the UFC roster was so out of date that it made no sense to use it as a resource, the UFC's online roster. And so it's, how are you going to figure out who's fighting in the UFC at any one time? The roster's way out of date. You have to develop your own resources for that. And I've transferred it over to Bloody Elbow in the long term. And this is probably the only concerted effort I've ever seen from the UFC to actually get their roster to look anything like what it actually should look like. So maybe that means something for the future. Maybe it means WME IMG is finally paying attention to that. Maybe it's just a one-off thing. They decided to clean it up and it'll just get messier and messier over the next few years. That would be kind of my guess. Anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow night on the 6th round for UFC 208, and we'll be back next week to talk about UFC Halifax, Travis Brown versus Derek Lewis. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Give this video a like if you like. Follow me on Twitter at TheZaneSimon, and keep an eye out on Bloody Elbow for more cut news, because it looks like this could be an ongoing thing and we probably haven't seen the end of it yet.